A quiet college town, 4 young people in the prime of their lives. A familiar rental house where friends gathered after class. No visible threats, no public conflicts, no warning signs that tragedy was about to strike. Yet within just a few hours on the early morning of November 13th, 2022, everything changed. 4 University of Idaho students were brutally killed inside their own home. No direct witnesses to the attack. No cameras capturing the moment of violence. No murder weapon recovered. Police were left with only a knife sheath, a few grainy security camera images, cell phone data, and a single question that would haunt an entire community. Who did this, and why? The answer would send shockwaves across America. The suspect was not some unstable drifter or mysterious criminal, but a doctoral student specializing in criminology, writing his dissertation on the behavior of those who commit crimes. This is the story of what has become known as the Idaho University murders, a case that would test the limits of modern investigative techniques and leave profound questions unanswered even after its legal conclusion. Moscow is a small college town nestled in the rolling hills of northern Idaho, home to approximately 25,000 residents when school is in session. The University of Idaho dominates the landscape and the local economy, giving the town that quintessential college atmosphere where students make up a significant portion of the population. In a place like Moscow, violent crime is rare. Neighbors know each other. Students walk home late at night without fear, and the most common police calls involve noise complaints from weekend parties or minor traffic violations. The University of Idaho itself is known for its strong sense of community. Greek life thrives here, with fraternities and sororities forming the social backbone for many students. Football Saturdays bring the town together, and the bars along Main Street fill with crowds celebrating or commiserating depending on how the Vandals performed. For many students living off campus in rental houses near the university is a rite of passage, a chance to experience independence while remaining close to classes and friends. One such house stood at 1122 King Road, a multi-level rental home just a short walk from campus. The white structure had become a familiar gathering spot, the kind of place where roommates and their friends would congregate after a night out or on lazy Sunday afternoons. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the house itself, but it had become home to 6 students who lived there during the fall semester of 2022, like thousands of similar rental properties in college towns across America. But in 22. King Road was a place where young people navigated the transition from adolescence to adulthood, where friendships deepened and futures were planned. In early November 2022, as the fall semester moved toward finals and the holiday's life at 1122 King Road proceeded normally, football season was winding down. Students were balancing academic pressures with social activities, and the rhythm of college life continued its familiar pattern. There were no known threats against the residents, no escalating disputes, no reason to believe that this particular house or these particular students were in any danger. Among the residents were 4 students whose lives would be cut tragically short. Madison. Mogan, known to friends as Maddie, was 21 years old and a senior. She had been close friends with Kaylee Goncalves since childhood, and their bond remained strong through their college years. Those who knew Maddie described her as warm and loyal, someone who lit up a room with her presence. Kaylee Goncalves, also 21, was equally beloved by her family and friends. Energetic and outgoing, Kaylee was approaching graduation and looking forward to the next chapter of her life. She had plans, dreams, and a future that seemed bright and full of possibility. Zanika Nodal was 20 years old and in a relationship with Ethan Chapin. She shared the house with the other students and had become an integral part of the group dynamic that made 1122 King Road feel like home. Ethan Chapin, also 20, was a sophomore and a member of a fraternity. Though he did not officially live at 1122 King Road, he frequently stayed there with his girlfriend Zana. On the night of November 12th, he would be at the house, a decision that would place him in the path of unimaginable violence. All 4 were ordinary college students. None had criminal records or connections to dangerous individuals. They were navigating the typical challenges of young adulthood, focused on classes, relationships, and planning for life after graduation. Meanwhile, roughly 8 miles away in Pullman, Washington, another young person was pursuing an academic path that would intersect with these 4 lives in the most horrific way imaginable. Brian Christopher Kohberger was born in 1994 and raised in Pennsylvania. Those who knew him during his younger years described a person who sometimes struggled socially, reportedly experiencing bullying and difficulty fitting in. As he grew older, Kohberger developed an intense interest in criminal justice and psychology. He pursued undergraduate studies in these fields, then earned a master's degree in criminal justice. His academic focus was sharp and specific. He wanted to understand the criminal mind to study how and why people commit violent acts. In the summer of 2022, Kohberger moved across the country to begin a doctoral program in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman. As a graduate student, he served as a teaching assistant for some courses and engaged in research related to criminal behavior. He conducted surveys and interviews designed to explore the thoughts and motivations of those who break the law. It was the kind of work that required analytical distance, the ability to examine dark human impulses without becoming consumed by them. The irony would later become inescapable. A man studying the psychology of criminals would himself be accused and ultimately convicted of one of the most shocking crimes in recent Idaho history. The evening of November 12, 2022, began like countless other Saturday nights in a college town. Students celebrated the end of another week, gathering at parties, bars, and familiar hangouts. Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves went out to a local bar, then stopped at a food truck that had become a popular late-night destination. Security cameras captured them laughing and chatting, appearing relaxed and happy. After getting food, they called a rideshare and returned to 1122 King Road, arriving home in the early morning hours of November 13th. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin attended a party at his fraternity house. They too returned to 1122 King Road in the early morning, with Ethan planning to spend the night with Xana, as he often did. 2 other roommates were also at the house that night, each in their own rooms. They would later become crucial to understanding what happened, though they were not harmed in the attack. Between midnight and 4 a.m., the students were engaged in typical late-night activities. Phone records would later show some social media use texts to friends, the mundane digital footprints of young people winding down after a night out. There were no calls to 911, no messages indicating fear or danger. Based on subsequent investigation, authorities believe the attack occurred sometime between approximately 4 and 4:25 a.m. The timeline that investigators eventually pieced together relied on multiple sources of data. Cell phone location information would prove critical in establishing movements near the house. Security cameras in the neighborhood captured a white Hyundai Elantra passing through the area multiple times during the relevant time frame. And most significantly, one of the surviving roommates provided testimony that would later form a key part of the probable cause affidavit. Dylan Mortensen, one of the roommates, reported hearing sounds during the night that initially seemed like normal house noises, perhaps someone coming home or moving around. But then she heard what she thought might be crying or whimpering. Concerned, she opened her bedroom door and observed a figure dressed in black, wearing a mask, with a tall, athletic build. The person walked past her toward the sliding glass door at the back of the house. One detail stood out in her recollection. The intruder had bushy eyebrows, frozen in fear and confusion, processing what she had witnessed, but perhaps not yet grasping the full horror of what had occurred. Dylan did not immediately call for help. This delay would later generate intense scrutiny and speculation from those following the case. Though experts in trauma psychology have noted that freezing in response to extreme fear is a well-documented phenomenon, it was not until nearly midday on November 13th that a 911 call was placed from one of the roommates' phones. The initial report indicated an unconscious person at the residence. When police arrived at 1122 King Road, they discovered a scene of profound tragedy. 4 young people were dead victims of multiple stab wounds. The community of Moscow was shattered. News spread quickly through the small town, and fear gripped the university campus. Parents called their children, demanding they come home immediately. Students who had felt safe walking alone at night now traveled in groups, constantly looking over their shoulders. Was there a serial killer loose in Moscow? Was the perpetrator someone connected to the victims, or a random predator who might strike again? In the crucial early days following the murders, police faced intense pressure to provide answers while simultaneously being criticized for releasing limited information. Investigators were working around the clock, but the initial leads were frustratingly thin. The first major break came from security camera footage. Investigators identified a white Hyundai Elantra, an older model, that had been seen in the area of King Road multiple times around the time of the murders. Police publicly appealed for information about this vehicle, asking anyone who owned or knew of such a car to come forward. This single detail triggered a massive effort. Thousands of Hyundai Elantras of the relevant model years existed in Idaho and the surrounding states. Investigators began the painstaking work of tracking down and eliminating vehicles one by one. Eventually, their attention turned to a white Elantra registered to Brian Kohberger. The second critical piece of evidence came from the crime scene itself. Investigators recovered a knife sheath in one of the bedrooms. The sheath, designed to hold a car bar-style knife, bore a distinctive feature: a small amount of DNA left on the snap button. Analysis of this DNA revealed a male profile that did not match anyone in the criminal database. Unable to identify the contributor through traditional means, investigators turned to genetic genealogy, a technique that had gained prominence in recent years for solving cold cases. By uploading the DNA profile to genealogical databases and constructing family trees, investigators narrowed their focus. They then obtained a sample from trash discarded at the Kohberger family home in Pennsylvania. The DNA from that trash belonged to Brian Kohberger's father. Statistical analysis indicated that the DNA on the knife sheath was consistent with being from the biological child of the person who discarded that trash, pointing directly to Brian Kohberger, with overwhelming probability. The third pillar of the investigation involved cell phone location data. By analyzing which cell towers Kohberger's phone connected to over time, investigators could track his general movements. The data revealed a troubling pattern. Kohberger's phone had been in the vicinity of 1122 King Road on multiple occasions in the months leading up to the murders, suggesting he had driven past or near the house at least a dozen times. More damning still, on the night of the murders, Kohberger's phone showed a period of inactivity or disconnection during the critical window when the attack was believed to have occurred. Before and after this gap, the phone's location data placed him traveling between Pullman and Moscow, consistent with the timeline investigators had constructed. When all the pieces were assembled, a picture emerged. The vehicle matched. The DNA matched. The cell phone data placed him near the scene, and the physical description from the surviving witness matched details visible in Kohberger's driver's license photo, including the distinctive bushy eyebrows. From an investigative standpoint, this convergence of evidence was compelling. From a legal standpoint, prosecutors would argue it constituted proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys would later challenge various aspects of this evidence, questioning the reliability of cell phone location data, the chain of custody for the DNA sample, and other procedural matters. But the overall framework of the case against Brian Kohberger was beginning to solidify. After the fall semester ended, Brian Kohberger drove his white Hyundai Elantra across the country from Washington to his family's home in Pennsylvania, accompanied by his father. During the cross-country journey, Indiana State Police pulled the vehicle over twice for minor traffic violations. At that point, Kohberger had not yet been publicly named as a suspect, and both stops ended with warnings rather than citations. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the investigation was reaching its conclusion. Prosecutors had assembled enough evidence to seek an arrest warrant. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 2022, a coordinated operation involving local police and the FBI descended on the Kohberger family residence in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. Brian Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. The arrest stunned the quiet Pennsylvania community. Neighbors described the Kohberger family as generally unremarkable people who kept to themselves. Brian was known to some as occasionally awkward or intense, but there had been no obvious red flags that would have predicted involvement in a quadruple homicide. Kohberger waived his right to contest extradition, agreeing to return to Idaho to face charges. He was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. If convicted, he faced the possibility of the death penalty. During his initial court appearances, Kohberger maintained his composure. He did not enter a guilty plea, and his defense team began preparing for what everyone anticipated would be a lengthy and complex trial. The defense strategy initially focused on challenging the evidence piece by piece. They suggested that the cell phone data could be explained by innocent driving habits, that Kohberger occasionally went for late-night drives to clear his head. They questioned the reliability of the genetic genealogy methods used to identify him. They hinted that there might be alternative explanations for the presence of his DNA on the knife sheath. Idaho is a state that retains capital punishment. Given the severity of the crimes, the number of victims, and the apparent lack of significant mitigating factors, prosecutors moved forward with the process to seek the death penalty. This decision set the stage for what promised to be a high-stakes legal battle that could take years to resolve, with Kohberger's life hanging in the balance. The legal maneuvering continued through 2023 and into 2024. Motions were filed and argued. Evidence was challenged and defended. The families of the victims waited for their day in court, hoping for answers and justice. Then, in a development that surprised many observers, negotiations between the prosecution and defense resulted in a plea agreement. In mid-2025, Brian Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the state withdrawing its pursuit of the death penalty. The agreement meant several things. First, it ensured that Kohberger would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Second, it spared the families of the victims the ordeal of a lengthy trial with all the painful testimony and graphic evidence that would have entailed. Third, it eliminated any possibility that Kohberger might be executed by the state. And fourth, critically, it meant that many questions would remain unanswered because Kohberger would not be required to explain his actions in detail or provide a full account of what happened that night. At the sentencing hearing, the court imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murder charges, plus an additional prison term for the burglary charge. Practically speaking, Brian Kohberger will die in prison. Family members of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court. Their statements were filled with anguish and grief. They spoke of the futures stolen from their loved ones, the milestones that would never be celebrated, the grandchildren who would never be born. Many expressed frustration that they might never fully understand why this happened. Kohberger himself offered no detailed explanation. He acknowledged his guilt as part of the plea agreement, but did not elaborate on his motivations or provide the kind of comprehensive confession that might have brought some measure of understanding to the families and the public. Even with a guilty plea and life sentences imposed, fundamental questions linger. The most significant unknown is motive. Investigators found no evidence of a prior relationship between Kohberger and any of the victims. They had not dated, were not classmates, had no documented conflicts. Various theories have circulated in media coverage and online discussions. Some have speculated about possible misogyny or resentment toward the social world the victims represented. Others have wondered if Kohberger, as someone studying criminal behavior, became pathologically obsessed with the idea of committing a crime himself, crossing the line from observer to participant in some twisted intellectual exercise. But these remain speculations. The court did not make findings about motive, and Kohberger has not provided a clear explanation. The why may be something only he knows, or perhaps something even he cannot fully articulate. Another frustrating gap in the case is the absence of the murder weapon. While the knife sheath containing Kohberger's DNA was recovered, the actual knife used in the attack has never been found. Investigators presumably searched extensively, including areas along the routes Kohberger was believed to have traveled, but to no avail. From an evidentiary standpoint, the absence of the weapon was not fatal to the case given the other evidence available. From a public perspective, however, it adds to the sense of incompleteness that surrounds the case. The behavior of the surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, has been the subject of considerable public debate and sometimes harsh criticism. Questions have been raised about why she did not call 911 immediately after seeing the intruder. Some have wondered if she could have prevented the deaths of her roommates if she had acted differently. Experts in trauma psychology have pushed back strongly against such criticism. When confronted with extreme danger, human beings do not always respond in rational or predictable ways. The fight-or-flight response is well known, but equally common is the freeze response, in which a person becomes temporarily paralyzed by fear, unable to process what is happening or formulate an appropriate reaction. Dylan was a young college student who witnessed something terrifying and incomprehensible in her own home in the middle of the night. That she did not react with perfect clarity and decisiveness is entirely consistent with what we know about how people respond to trauma. Importantly, law enforcement has never suggested that Dylan or any other surviving roommate bore any responsibility for what happened. No charges have been brought against them, and they are regarded as victims of this tragedy as well, forced to live with the knowledge of what occurred under their roof. Since his incarceration, reports about Kohberger's behavior in jail have described him as generally calm and composed. He has spent time reading, maintaining his routines, and showing little outward emotion about his situation. Some have interpreted this as cold detachment or lack of remorse. Others note that it could simply reflect his personality or his understanding of his circumstances. There is a haunting irony in the fact that a person who devoted years of academic study to understanding criminal behavior now finds himself confined as a convicted criminal. Did Kohberger see himself as conducting some kind of perverse research? Was there a moment when his professional interest in crime transformed into a compulsion to commit one? Or was his choice of academic specialization itself a reflection of darker impulses that were present all along? These questions are unlikely to ever be fully answered. The Idaho University murders case offers several lessons that extend beyond the specifics of this particular tragedy. First, it demonstrates the power and sophistication of modern investigative techniques. The combination of DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, cell phone location tracking, and traditional detective work enabled law enforcement to identify and apprehend a suspect even in the absence of direct witnesses or a recovered murder weapon. The technological tools available to investigators today are extraordinarily powerful, capable of uncovering connections and movements that would have been invisible just a generation ago. Second, the case highlights the persistent question of motive and meaning in the aftermath of violence. The legal system is designed to determine guilt or innocence, to assess whether a defendant's actions meet the elements of a particular crime. It is far less equipped to answer the question of why. Even when justice is served in a legal sense, with a conviction secured and punishment imposed, families and communities are often left grappling with a void of understanding. Third, the case reminds us that darkness can lurk beneath seemingly ordinary surfaces. Brian Kohberger was not a stereotypical monster. He was a graduate student, someone pursuing higher education, someone who by outward appearances was attempting to build a professional future. The victims were not engaged in risky behavior or associating with dangerous people. They were college students doing what college students do, living their lives in a place that had always felt safe. The randomness and senselessness of the violence is perhaps what makes it most disturbing. Finally, the case raises ongoing questions about how institutions and communities can better identify and respond to warning signs of potential violence. While there is no evidence that Kohberger exhibited clear, actionable red flags that would have predicted these crimes, the broader challenge remains. How do we distinguish between someone with academic or intellectual interest in dark subjects and someone who poses a genuine threat? Where is the line between respecting individual privacy and intervening when concerning behavior emerges? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions worth continuing to ask. For the families of Madison, Mogan Cayley Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, no legal outcome can restore what was taken from them. The guilty plea and life sentences represent a form of justice, but they do not bring back their loved ones. The four students had their whole lives ahead of them, with dreams and aspirations that will now never be realized. Their deaths are a permanent loss, not just to their families, but to everyone who knew them, and to the broader community that has been forever changed by this tragedy. As we reflect on this case, it is worth remembering that behind the timelines and evidence and legal proceedings are real people whose lives ended far too soon. The story of the Idaho University murders is not just a story about investigative techniques or legal strategy. It is a story about loss, about grief, about the fragility of safety and normalcy, and about the enduring pain that violence leaves in its wake. If you found this detailed examination of the Idaho University murders informative, please consider subscribing to this channel for future coverage of complex criminal cases. These are stories that deserve to be told with care, accuracy, and respect for all involved. Share your thoughts in the comments, but please remember to keep the discussion grounded in facts and respectful of the victims, their families, and everyone affected by this tragedy. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to understand, not to judge, without evidence, but to learn from these difficult chapters in our shared history. Only by examining such cases thoughtfully can we hope to build a society better equipped to prevent similar tragedies in the future.